So, you've been hearing people talk about all the different types of cross-stitch fabric. You're hearing gibberish words like Aida, evenweave, linen slub, and esoteric talk of things like counts and stitching over two. But what does all of that mean? And what's the best cross-stitch fabric for you? Don't worry, I got you. If you're new here today, hello, my name is Michelle and I love to do all of the crafts, but especially the stitchy ones. If you're into cross-stitch, yarn crafts, a bit of sewing and general craft experimentation, this might just be the channel for you. And if you're not new here today, welcome back, and as always, you are awesome. Alright, let's get cracking. Regardless of cross-stitch fabric type, you will always see them referred to in terms of their count. So let's start there for the people who aren't familiar. What is cross-stitch fabric count? All types of cross-stitch fabric have small holes to guide your needle. You can see here they're laid out in a grid type layout. We'll call the area in between 4 of these holes a square. So the fabric count is actually referencing how many of these squares are in 1 inch. For example, here we have 14 squares to 1 inch, which means we are looking at 14 count fabric. This is 28 count, and you can see it has twice as many squares to 1 inch. Simple. If you imagine your stitches will typically take up 1 of these squares, you can also think of the count as how many stitches you'll get to 1 inch, which makes it easy to work out how large a finished piece will be. For example, if you're stitching a pattern that is 70 stitches wide and you're planning to do it on 14 count fabric, you can easily figure out that your finished piece will be 5 inches wide. The confusion really starts when people start throwing around terms like higher or lower count, because it can be a bit unintuitive for beginners. Here is an example square, 14 stitches across on both our 14 and 28 count fabrics. The higher count fabric results in smaller stitches and a smaller finished piece. The lower count fabric results in larger stitches and a larger finished piece. It's kind of backwards to what some people would intuitively expect, and I've seen more than one experienced stitcher ask for higher count fabric when they actually meant lower, and vice versa. Anyway, count goes up, stitch size goes down. That's all you really need to remember. Okay, so now we understand about fabric count. What are the different types of cross-stitch fabric? Technically, there are 2 main types, Aida and evenweave. But evenweave is further split into cotton evenweave and linen evenweave. So colloquially and for the rest of this video, you're likely to just see those referred to as evenweave and linen, respectively. Don't worry, this is not as confusing as it sounds, and there are easy ways to tell all 3 fabric types apart. Aida is the most distinctive. As you can hopefully see here, it's made up of groups of 4 threads weaved together with very clear holes forming that square grid. It's the most common fabric sold in non-specialist craft shops, so chances are you've seen this around. Even weaves are different in that they don't have those fat groups of 4 threads. They're made from single threads weaved together, which generally makes for a much looser and less stiff fabric than Aida. Cotton evenweave uses very smooth and even threads and tends to be very flat looking, very pure and tidy, whereas linen has a more natural texture and will often have small variations in the thickness of its threads, or little bits of basically fluff known as slubs. So we'll get into the pros and cons of all of these in a minute, but first I want to answer a couple of important questions. First, which is the best cross-stitch fabric for beginners? Now, you might already have decided just from the look of them which of these cross-stitch fabric types is for you. Maybe you fell in love at first sight and nothing will sway you, and if that's the case, I say go for it. You should love what you are stitching. But if you're not quite sure, allow me to recommend you start with Aida, with some caveats. Aida is generally the easiest fabric to work with for a number of reasons. As we've seen, it has by far the most well-defined grid of holes of all the 3 fabric types, which means it's going to be a lot easier to find those holes. If you haven't started stitching yet, that might sound faintly ridiculous, but trust me, it is quite the learning curve trying to find the hole with your needle from around the back of the fabric. Also with Aida, you'll almost always work your stitches over 1, which means 1 stitch equals 1 of those squares. This makes counting and placement of your stitches a lot easier, especially if you go with a fairly low count like the ever popular 14 count. It's just 1 less thing to worry about when you're just getting started. Another benefit is that Aida is quite stiff compared to even weaves, which means it's much more suited to stitching in hand. As a beginner, you probably don't own a fancy frame to hold your work for you, so this is a really big advantage. But beware, one situation I would definitely not recommend Aida for is if the pattern you are planning to stitch involves a lot of fractional stitches. An in-depth guide to fractional stitches is out of scope of this video, but to sum up, full cross stitch, half cross stitch, quarter cross stitch, and 3/4 cross stitch. stitch. See how those last two use more than just the standard 4 holes that we're used to using for full cross stitches. You can absolutely stitch these on Aida, but you will need a sharp needle and a lot of patience. Trust me, I speak from experience. So how do you cross stitch on even weave fabrics then, and how is it different to stitching on Aida? For both even weave and linen fabrics, the standard is to stitch what's called over 2. Whereas with Aida fabrics you'll use your 4 corner holes to make a cross stitch over 1 square like so, on even weave you'll count 2 squares in either direction as 1 stitch. So, couple of things. First off, this is a little more tricky to count and place stitches on than stitching over 1. It's not a huge deal when you get used to it, but as a first timer it is a little weird, and you should probably expect to have to pick out some stitches when you realise they're half a stitch over from where they should be. Secondly, you've probably figured this out already, but if you're stitching over 1 on 14 count fabric, you will get 14 stitches to an inch. If you're stitching over 2 on 28 count fabric, you will get 14 stitches to an inch. So if that's the case, and stitching on Aida is much easier, why not just use that, right? Well, for a start, a lot of people find Aida to be the worst looking of the 3. Tastes vary, of course. I don't mind the look of Aida at all, but even I have to admit a high count linen is a thing of beauty. As alluded to earlier, stitching over 2 also makes it much easier to handle fractionals. Since we're stitching over 2, it's easy to use those extra holes in the middle to create quarter, 3/4, or whatever other weird stitches we might need. And finally, there's just a lot more flexibility there. Yes, you can stitch over 2 on 28 count and come out with a finished piece exactly the same size as it would have been on 14 count Aida. But you also have the option to work over 1 and end up with a piece exactly half that size. On this full coverage piece, for example, I'm stitching over 1 on 28 count because, among other reasons, doing it the standard way would just make the finished piece bigger than I wanted. Some people even like to mix and match, stitching over 1 and over 2 in the same project. For example, this piece, stitched by the excellent Stitchy Rin, whose channel you should all be following, you can see that the smaller animals at the top there are stitched over 1 and have much smaller stitches than the rest of the piece. This allows for a lot more detail in a smaller space. Another use case for this is if you are stitching, say, a person, you might want the exposed skin to be stitched over 1 to give it a smoother effect than the clothing stitched over 2. We've already covered a lot of pros and cons so far, so let's sum up. Aida is easier to work with for beginners, great for stitching in hand, and generally the most widely available type of fabric. All of the fabric types can be found in different colours, but you'll find that Aida tends to have the widest range of fun patterns and prints. On the other hand, it's not available in high counts, unsuited to fractional stitches, and generally considered to be the ugliest of the 3, although your mileage may vary on that last part. Both even weave and linen are available in higher counts, great for fractional stitching, and generally considered to be prettier than Aida. But they are a bit trickier to count on, and benefit greatly from a frame of some kind as they tend to be much less stiff than Aida and therefore more difficult to stitch in hand. Linen in particular has a beautiful natural texture, but that natural texture can cause stitches to be less square than on Aida or even weave, meaning it's not always suitable for very geometric patterns. Cotton even weave, on the other hand, is a much more regular, or might I say even, weave. Okay, so after I posted on Instagram last week that I was planning to make this video, somebody popped up in my DMs with an extra question. But she asked to remain anonymous because I think she thinks this question is kind of silly. So first of all, can I just say, none of us were born with this knowledge. Some people watching this have probably been stitching for longer than I've been alive, and some people just picked it up yesterday. At some point, we all learn these things, and please never be ashamed to ask me basic questions. Okay, that said, the question is, how do I know how much fabric I'll need for a given project? So if you recall, back near the beginning of this video, we looked at how you can take the fabric count and the stitch count of your pattern and use those numbers to work out how large your finished piece will be. Let's say we have a pattern that's 140 stitches wide, 196 stitches tall, and we're planning to stitch it over 2 on 28 count fabric. Stitching over 2 on 28 count is going to mean we get 14 stitches to an inch. So a bit of basic division shows us that the pattern will work up to be 10 inches wide by 14 inches tall. Stitching that same pattern over 1 on the 28 count would be 5 inches wide by 7 inches tall. And stitching it over 1 on some, say, 18 count Aida would result in a finished piece 7.8 inches wide by 10.9 inches tall. Now you have the size of your actual stitching, you'll want to leave some extra space around all 4 edges. Depending on what exactly you plan to do with the finished piece, you might need more or less leeway, but the standard is generally to leave about 3 inches on all 4 sides. That way, whether you decide to frame the piece or turn it into a cushion or whatever else, you have plenty of fabric to play with. Looking back at our examples then, you'll want to add 6 inches total to both the width and height of your stitching. So on 28 count fabric, stitching over 2, you would need a piece of fabric at least 16 inches wide by 20 inches tall. Stitching over 1 on that same fabric, you'd need a piece 11 by 13 inches. And for the 18 count Aida, you would need at least 13.8 by 16.9, which we can just round up to a much tidier 14 inches by 17. I appreciate that is a lot of numbers and you might need to rewind the video to let it sink in, but honestly, once you've done it a couple of times, this just becomes second nature. You got this. The last thing I want to touch on in this video is that we've only really discussed the 3 main groupings of fabrics, but you will hear other words thrown around too, and on top of that, fabric isn't even the only thing you can stitch on. For example, plastic mesh like this is popular in making ornaments, keyrings, anything that needs to be really rigid. And show a cross-stitcher basically anything with a grid of holes in it and they can't resist. So you'll see people stitching on shoes, bags. I saw one person on Vero stitching on the top of a Google Home Mini. The world is our oyster, as long as the world happens to have a convenient grid of holes punched into it. Even in terms of fabric though, there are more levels of detail. I don't want to get bogged down by this too much because this video is targeted towards beginners, but you'll sometimes see people using subcategories of even weave depending on what material it's made from. Lugana, for example, is a very popular type of even weave, and basically what that means is it's roughly half-y-half cotton and viscose rather than just pure cotton. Likewise, you'll hear different names for different types of linen, like Newcastle linen or Belfast linen. Again, these can refer to the fibre content, but some brands also give different names to their linens depending on what count the fabric is. So yeah, it can be pretty confusing, but honestly, as a beginner, you do not need to know about this. Just stick to the big 3 categories and maybe over time you'll develop a preference for a particular type of even weave or a particular brand of linen and you'll naturally pick this stuff up. It is really not necessary when you are new. Alright, I hope that was a decent primer and answered any questions you might have about the different types of cross-stitch fabric. If there's anything I didn't cover, of course, please do let me know down in the comments and I'll be happy to answer more questions for you or go and find an expert who can. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon with some more crafty nonsense, so in the meantime, have a brilliant rest of your day and keep making cool stuff.